During the 1980s, the United States experienced a prolonged farm crisis. During this crisis, American farmers faced farm foreclosures and a loss of their livelihoods at a rate not experienced since the Great Depression. If you are aware of the crisis, you probably know how difficult it was for the individuals involved. This part is the most raw and emotional, and we tend to focus on this aspect and their loss and not on the root causes of the crisis. We often view history in a linear way, and the idea of a farm crisis and the loss of the family farm plays well into the timeline of the decline of rural America. It is expected by many that the widespread failure of family farms in the 1980s meant a consolidation of farms into large corporate entities with no turning back. We are going to answer this question by looking to the past and the context that history can provide us. By the 1950s and 1960s, the world's population was growing at an exponential rate with no end in sight. And anyone with knowledge of this issue knew that a great global collapse would occur if we could not find a way to increase food production worldwide. While many had their fear and anxiety focused on the threat of Cold War nuclear annihilation, a group of dedicated scientists, farmers, and policymakers saved humankind, especially for the world's poorest, from impending famine. This miraculous increase in yields due to adoptions of new agriculture technologies is known as the Green Revolution. The seeds of the Green Revolution, also known as the Third Agricultural Revolution, were sown by farmer turned politician Henry Wallace, who eventually became the second vice president under Franklin Roosevelt. Henry Wallace was born in 1888 and grew up in Ames, Iowa, to a moderately wealthy family who gained regional prominence by being the publishers of a successful agricultural newspaper, Wallace's Farmer. Henry's father, Harry, decided to return to school and become a dairy cow professor at Iowa State University. During his tenure at Iowa State, the elder Wallace's most famous student was George Washington Carver, an African-American botanist famous for his work on developing many of the modern uses of the peanut. While Carver was allowed to attend the university, he was not allowed to live on campus with the other white students. The Wallaces were a very progressive Republican family and offered to house Carver while he was in school. It was during this time that young Henry bonded with Carver and took a particular interest in plants and genetics. While Carver seemed to be obsessed with peanuts, Henry began a similar emphatic interest in his state's staple crop, corn. Following in his father's shoes, Henry also attended Iowa State University, studying agriculture with a focus on the idea of the creation of a hybrid corn seed to increase yields. Up until that point, many corn farmers were searching for the most aesthetically pleasing variety of corn without much thought of the impact of drought or regional climate differences. The central idea of a hybrid seed is that by crossbreeding different varieties of seeds that each have different strengths, one can create a more resilient plant. In 1926, Henry founded Pioneer Hybrid Seed Company, which soon became a huge financial success. The 1930s brought a decade of hardship for American farmers, who faced both an economic crisis in the Great Depression and an ecological crisis in the Dust Bowl. At this point, Wallace had obtained notoriety in the national farming community and was appointed by newly elected President Franklin Roosevelt as his Secretary of Agriculture, eventually becoming vice president. In 1940, during his stint as VP, Wallace took a state trip to Mexico to observe their farming practices. He was appalled to find that it took a Mexican farmer 50 times longer to produce a single bushel of corn when compared to a farmer in Iowa. Sensing a potential problem, Wallace convinced the administration to set up an agronomy program in Mexico led by Norman Borlaug with the goal of increasing yields. Borlaug worked timelessly developing hybrid corn and wheat seeds that were more resistant to the drier conditions of the Mexican climate. He eventually won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on hybrid seeds and is credited with helping save 2 billion people from starvation. In addition to hybrid seeds, the Green Revolution was spurred on by adoption of chemical fertilizers, pesticides, and new advancements in agriculture machinery technology. These advancements did not happen all at once and often took many years to sequentially occur. This was especially true at the national level. While the Green Revolution in the United States was focused on widespread use of fertilizer and pesticides, many less developed countries such as China and India focused on adopting hybrid rice varieties and improving irrigation practices. This reality meant that countries with more developed agriculture systems began to greatly overproduce, and that underdeveloped countries had a lag of time between the onset of the Green Revolution in their country and in the ensuing increases in yields. In the late 1960s, the United States began to fill the shortfall of commodity crops in rapidly growing third world nations by exporting their new excesses in yield. The sudden major introduction of the global market sent farmland valuations skyrocketing and began a decade-long speculative frenzy. So, following World War II, Europe needed to be rebuilt and obtained a significant amount of this funding from the United States under the Marshall Plan. This redevelopment created the need for countries to hold dollar-denominated deposits to finance construction. These deposits held in foreign banks or foreign branches are known as Eurodollars because of this, and this is still today regardless of where they are stored. Eurodollars are not subject to Federal Reserve requirements and are considered riskier and therefore command a higher interest rate. So Eurodollar transactions are large and generally occur overnight, and this lack of regulation can cause a black box of information where the true exposure to foreign lending is unknown. American banks rushed to lend in Eurodollars to developing nations following World War II. Because of the lag between investment and increased efficiencies, developing nations generally have to rely on credit to finance imports and energy. Therefore, rises in interest rates hurt developing nations more. The increases in inflation and fuel cost that was discussed in a previous video of the energy crisis during the 1970s hit Latin America especially hard. Their solution was simply to increase the levels of debt they were taking on from American banks. American banks were keen to lend this money because they were experiencing a decrease in domestic banking demand due to new alternative investments for consumers, such as the equity market. Particularly, corporate clients were lost to the new commercial papers market, severely curtailing the demand for working capital loans. By the 1980s, third world agricultural output began to catch up, but the high fuel costs lingering from the 1970s oil crises ensured that more and more debt was needed. Eventually, it became clear that Mexico, Brazil, and many other Latin American countries would be unable to pay back the loans, and a worldwide recession began. This was known as the LDC debt crisis, which stands for the Less Developed Countries Debt Crisis. Demand for American agriculture commodities fell considerably in 1982. An embargo on wheat exports to the Soviet Union in 1980 certainly didn't help. So in conclusion, the rapid increases in farm productivity in the U.S. caused farmland prices to rise quickly, entering a speculative phase. Faced with the prospect of an international market, ag banks liberally gave out loans to farmers looking to expand their operations. These farmers, mostly family farming operations, bought up land from smaller tenant farmers during the 1970s, who in turn took their payout and moved to cities for increased opportunities. These large family farm operations believed rapid land acquisition was required in order to spread out the additional fixed costs of modern farming machinery. Inflation from fuel costs caused farmers to increase the amount of debt they took on. Many of the loans from ag banks were based on collateral rather than cash flows. Therefore, taking on debt to expand your farm increases your collateral and your ability to secure more credit. Additionally, these loans often came with variable interest rates. While the farming sector of the 1970s was performing well, the rest of the economy was not. To put an end to a decade of inflation, the Fed drastically increased interest rates, which spurred the LDC crisis in 1982. Now, family farming operations overextended were finding they had no cash flow due to it all going to service the variable interest rates that never seemed to stop going up. Farmland values were making continual gains, increasing the need for debt financing, even when crop prices fell. Many of these overextended farmers lost everything and had to surrender their farms to the banks. One would think at this point, corporations would step in and snatch up all the farmland and assets that had cratered in value due to the collapse in export demand. In reality, there exists a certain kind of farmer that I call the conservative farmer, who is especially fiscally responsible and wary of the use of debt financing. These conservative farmers stayed out of the speculative farmland craze and continued to maintain their existing farms. Once the crisis happened, these conservative farmers were the ones to buy up the foreclosed land from farmers and outside speculators for cheap. It is these conservative family farms that have contributed to increased yields by gradual and thoughtful capital investments, ensuring a greater relationship between yields and land value. Today, the U.S. experiences some of the same uncertainties when it comes to international demand for commodity exports. For a while, the U.S. government artificially propped up demand for corn by promoting ethanol through subsidies. Although ethanol production helps the rural economies of agriculture producing states, it doesn't make much economic sense and has begun to be phased out. We will continue to invest in research in development of new crops and uses, as well as innovative ideas such as using drone technologies to limit planting and loss areas, as well as increased economic forecasting. A final risk to consider is the non-diversified nature of ag banks in the U.S. In 1986, 70% of ag banks were based in the Great Plains, which made their lending abilities at risk to regional weather. In addition to ag banks, there is a federal system called the Farm Credit System, which is a mutual of sorts established in 1916 to offer additional subsidized ag loans. The FCS steadily gained loan share by offering aggressive interest rates. Today, 44% of all farm debt originates from the FCS. It is a fact that ag lenders that are non-diversified play an outsized role in the economy and are therefore susceptible to these non-diversifiable risks.